Okay, good morning and welcome to the California Board of Occupational Therapy meeting. We are coming to you from San Jose State University. Today's Thursday, March 9th, and the time is now 9:35 a.m. If we could please have a call to order and roll call.
Teresa. Here. Bianca. Here. Laura. Here. Richard.
Here.
Denise.
Here.
Jeff.
Here.
Sharon. Present.
Okay, we've established a quorum. The next item on the agenda is the President's remarks, and first off I would say Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to 2017. We've had quite the year already. From a professional standpoint, the profession is celebrating its 100th year. We did cap off that 100th year celebration, or start it, with a very big push from our professional association, the California Occupational Therapy Association. We took the lead for all these years on having a float in the Rose Parade. And I don't know how many of you saw it, but it was pretty amazing. For those of us, we did have a lot of therapists from all over the United States who came to work on it. I've actually grown up 5 minutes from the Rose Bowl my whole life, so I've always been involved in this parade in some capacity, and my nephew's actually a white suit, so I've loved it forever. I love it now, knowing that our profession, those who are not born in the Southern California area, absolutely know how precious this is. It was very good for our profession. We really demonstrated our value, which is a significant part of the Centennial Vision. We had consumers on that float, along with therapists that treated them. We had educators. We had our president, Heather Kitching, of our association. So it was a pretty fantastic push for occupational therapy. And last week we had our spring symposium in San Diego, and one of the writers on the float talked about her experiences being on that float. And I think one of the most significant things that resonated with me from a regulatory standpoint is how many consumers down that 4-mile ride on the float said, "Thank you for your service, you got me back to work," held up if they were wearing a splint, they held up their hand, or whatever it is they were doing. And so the riders really felt it first and foremost about what it meant from the consumer standpoint. And I think that's really important for this board to hear as we're continuing to really work with our primary goal of protecting the consumer for the state of California. So that was January, and we had a lot of great fun. I did also get to decorate the float, and actually got to work with the florists, who are now my fast friends, and every year when they come back, I think they're going to now stay with me, because they always look for Pasadena homes. So that being said, in February I had the privilege and honor to participate as part of a charge from our American Occupational Therapy Association president. Amy Lamb has a charge regarding field work, really thinking outside the box, thinking for the future. In other words, it's that 30,000 degree view, looking forward as we look to 2025 and actualizing many things beyond the 100th year Centennial Vision. So that was very pleasing to be able to contribute. I did participate as an occupational therapy practitioner. In the event that it were ever to come before our, if there was ever something that came before our license board and I was still on this license board, I of course would be recusing myself from that vote. But for now, it was a very great experience to participate in. When we get to the field work, I may add a bit more, as well as some of our representation here from the AOTN. In March, as you know, here we are, and I attended last weekend the Spring Symposium along with Vice President Richard Bookwalter. We presented about the California Occupational Therapy Board. We had a lively and robust participation as well as discussion, and it was at the end of the conference, so that was very pleasing. Further, we were able to attend a reception with one of the legislators. I think it's Todd Gloria, from that particular district, and have a very good discussion with him. And it was, we were right on the cusp of going into our sunset report. Both Vice President Bookwalter and I did go up for the hearing on Monday for our sunset review, and I'll reserve those comments to when we get to that section, but it was all very pleasing. And so this caps off, this meeting here is going to cap off the conclusion of a very, very busy and build-up time for the board. And hopefully we'll make some good decisions here, and 27 will go forth smoothly and as regularly scheduled meetings. And with that, I have no further comments. There's no board action to be taken on any of my comments, other than to move to item number 3, which are the board member remarks, and to open it up to our board. So I'll start first with Vice President Richard Bookwalter. Do you have any comments you want to add?
I think you covered everything because we did everything together. We did have one meeting. We did have one preparatory meeting in Sacramento for the hearing that we had, and maybe we can talk some more about that. The hearing last Monday. We went up to Sacramento, met with DCA staff to get some view of what was going on, what we're doing. We also met with a couple of Denise's legislators at that time, and with the athletic trainers and lobbyists at that time. Denise and Heather and I had a meeting there, which we'll talk about. Maybe we can talk about later. That's the only other thing I would add.
Jeff Farrow?
I have nothing to add today.
And down on this end, anybody starting first with Sharon Popovich and heading down? Does anybody have any comments to add?
Department of Occupational Therapy at Loma Linda just got recognized for the Community Service Award. So we'll have a little special, I guess, honorary thing at graduation, and then we have a little graduate provost. And we're just all getting ready to travel to Philadelphia to present at AOC.
All right, and seeing that there are no other remarks, again, and no action be taken on board member remarks, I would like to go to agenda item 4, which are public comment sections for items not on the agenda. Do we have any public comments for items not on the agenda? Before I move on to the sunset report, during public comments, I just wanted to ask, we have a number of public members here. You are not required to introduce yourself, but if you wanted to at this time, identify who you are, please just feel free to go ahead. Do we have any public that would like to introduce themselves?
Sure. Chuck Wilmarth, I'm the Director of State Affairs and Health Policy with the American Occupational Therapy Association.
Heather Kitching, President of the Occupational Therapy Association of California.
Sean Conway with the National Board for Certification in Occupational Therapy.
And we welcome all of you and thank you for your participation. Before I move off of public comments, I know you walked in. It's not an obligation, but did you want to introduce yourself? We are being webcast, so it's completely optional.
Oh, I'm Pam Richardson, occupational therapist, also Associate Dean of the College of Applied Sciences and Arts here at San Jose State. So welcome to San Jose State.
Thank you so much for having us. Okay. Seeing that there are no further comments, moving on to agenda item 5. Well, as we alluded to, we had our sunset review on Monday, March 6th. We were 4th of 5th. That sunset review was before the Business Profession and Economics Joint Senate Hearing Committee, Senator Hill and Assemblymember Salas, as well as a number of other members from both the Senate and Assembly. As you know, last year we had an ad hoc committee that worked with board staff on the items that would prepare us for the sunset review. Every 4-year, a board has to go before the legislature and really demonstrate what you've been doing, show your work, identify the needs so that you get that approval as you continue on through the next 4 years. So we were in our sunset review. We submitted a document at the conclusion, and by we, I mean the ad hoc committee had input, but a great significant thank you goes to our board staff as well as under the leadership of our executive director, Heather Martin. It was no small feat, but we submitted this sunset review at the end of December. Out of that process, the Joint Senate Committee submits questions back. We did not receive those questions until a week out from our sunset hearing, and I'll go through those questions in a moment. But to further outline the process, the Department of Consumer Affairs leadership, which we're very grateful for, as well as the Housing Business Consumer Services leadership, had us come into Sacramento, Richard, myself, and Heather, for a meeting and preparation on the Sunset Committee. And that really, this being both our first Sunset review process, Heather's second, we wanted to make sure that we were ready for this particular process. So, and they did as well. So we were very grateful for that. We met, we had some idea of where things were going. We were able to establish our process. The next week, the questions were actually delivered to our executive director. There are 12 questions, of which we still have time. We have 30 days to submit all 12 answers, although a great deal of work has already been done on those 12. Of the 4 that we were asked, the 4 questions that we were specifically noted that were likely to be asked of us, they were related to webcasting. They were related to, for example, is CBOT concerned? One was about Breeze. Is CBOT concerned about the ongoing cost for Breeze? Is there a way to disaggregate enforcement data to make it more useful? What impediments other than timing and planning impact the CBOT's ability to webcast its meeting? This meeting is being webcast, so as we stated to the Senate, 2017 is off to a great start. Also, should the Practice Act be amended to change CBOT's ratio of public members to professional members? So when we got to the hearing, essentially, again, we were 4th of 5th. I provided background and introductory comments about the field of occupational therapy, specifically when we were licensure was formed, the history, and the background about that. Vice President Bookwalter, which I'll turn that piece over to him in a moment, but he then took it to a different level of really bringing it to the day-to-day life. So we decided that we would give a background and then give the day-to-day life of an occupational therapist, so that in our introductory comments, the Senate would be left with really understanding the purpose of what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and why the consumer is benefiting from the service that are provided by this profession, as well as protected, as well as the regulatory and legislative work that we've done. So I took more the background regulatory legislative, he took the consumer protection piece. From that, our executive director answered the questions about the enforcement data, about Breeze. I answered the question about webcasting, and then Richard Bookwalter answered the question about the ratio. And with that, I'd like to turn it over first to Vice President Richard Bookwalter and Heather Martin to talk about any of their reflections in the Sunset Review.
Well, I'll just say that I thought it was a very interesting experience to go to. We did receive a webcast of the previous week's boards. All the healthcare boards were on 2 successive Mondays. We were the second Monday. And so it was interesting to review what the other boards were doing, some of the issues that they had had at previous sunsets that they had to overcome, the different workloads. Like the nursing board has 700, each board member looks at 700 disciplinary actions a year. It's a lot. And to hear just how everybody else is doing. So I thought it was a really valuable experience. I think that we did fine. Testimony, yes.
Heather, did you want to provide any comments about the Sunset Review process?
No, I think
think it went fairly smoothly. I think we were fortunate that they had other issues than they could breeze through us, so.
I do want to say again that I really am grateful to Heather and the staff for putting together those questions on such short notice, because we received on Saturday, Lisa and I were at the Spring Symposium, and we had a document to review that had at least draft answers to most of which were all the way there, in terms of what needed to be in the answers to the questions, and we just had a couple additions to the questions that we did, and having those questions all written up by the staff was great, and on a short turnaround time. So I commend you guys for doing that.
So the only question I have is, when will we know from them? Do we receive a report from the Joint Senate Committee? How are we identified when the sunset review process is officially closed?
They will introduce a bill that will change the 2018 sunset date to 2022.
And do we know approximately when that might be?
We don't. We have to await their decision, which obviously they're waiting for us to respond to the questions, which again are due 30 days from Monday. And then I think we will also have conversations, because the board had submitted several legislative proposals to be included in that bill, and so I think they will be reaching out to us because I feel like it was a very large laundry list, if you will, and that certainly they're not going to carry all of them, but that'll, I think, a conversation the committee staff will have.
So ideally, we might be, the legislative session is on now and goes till when?
I feel like last week in April is the deadline for bills to be heard in the House of Origin by the Policy Committee. So I think we will know before then.
So we might, April is OT month, by the way, to all of our members, and we might, and I know that there was some celebration from our professional association in April, correct? So we might talk offline about if the sunset review, and maybe even invite consumers this time. Maybe?
Okay. I have two questions I just want to follow up with. We saw a video of the previous Monday's, those of us who were testifying. So I'm wondering if the video was going to be available, or if there's of our testimony so we could review it.
Yes.
Since for future.
Would you like me to send a link?
Could we get a link to that?
I believe so.
That would be great, because I would love to review it. And there was Senator Hill, Jerry Hill, did have a question during we asked him if he could get back to him on, which was
It had to do with mental health.
mental health in the schools, and whether there was a scope of practice issue with any other profession in the area of autism, dealing with autism kids in the schools. And we didn't have an answer for him, and said that we would get back to him, and I feel that maybe we should gather some material on that.
We actually, everything that was just on Monday, all good comments. We haven't had a chance to speak, but there will be a follow-up letter. One of the things Heather Martin and I did speak about is there will be a follow-up letter to them, thanking them for that process. We could probably easily answer that, because there really isn't much of an answer. There isn't data of people coming before us to prove it,
That's right.
which is the answer I gave them. But that being said, we will be following up, and then the link to the sunset review, is it in the plan? Is it appropriate then and in the plan to put that on our website?
If you're requesting that it be added, we can certainly do that.
Well, let me ask our public member, if I can, some of our public members, would you find value in seeing the hearing, being able to access the hearing? Okay.
Yes, okay.
So that's probably our answer. Everybody okay with that? Okay. We don't have to make a motion on that, right? It's just a board task? Okay. So seeing that there are no further comments from is there anyone else on the board that Is there anyone else on the board that wants to speak about the sunset review process? Anyone on the ad hoc committee? Anything whatsoever? We do have a letter of support that came out from our professional association, the California Board of Occupational Therapy. We also had some comments from the president, who is present here today, Heather Kitching, in the open comment session, talking about the continuation. We're very grateful and thankful for the presence of both the lobbyists for occupational therapy, the lobbyists were there, the executive director of the California Association was there, Heather Kitching was there, another active OTAC member and educator, Laura Wu, was present and made comments. So if everybody wants to take a look at this letter and read it, I think best at this point, I would probably turn it over and ask Heather Kitching if you would simply like to comment on it rather than having me summarize it.
In general, the perspective of the State Association is one of very positive support. We appreciate the active collaboration with our licensing board over the last year plus, and it was our great honor to be there and to provide public comment in support of the licensing board continuing in existence. It's the perspective of our association that we've been invested for a good number of years at this point, which yielded this board coming to fruition, and we're very proud of it and all of the work that's been achieved to this point. So we steadfastly support all of the efforts in protecting the consumer and all of the intricacies of that as it ties to the work of the association as well, which crosses many areas, including sustaining the profession, but sustaining the profession in terms of it providing good service to the public that resides in California. So it was our great honor to be there and to see the process. And I suppose I would also like to say, as a member of the profession and a license holder myself as an individual, that it was very empowering to attend the hearing, to see the process, to see how our profession positions itself through this licensing board and its work. Was a very rewarding moment in terms of understanding what it really takes to bring our services to the members that reside, not the members, excuse me, the public members that reside in the state of California. So thank you for the opportunity.
Are there any other comments from those who were present or anything whatsoever? All right, well, we do.
Denise,
Yes.
as an occupational therapist for a number of years, I agree with what Heather was saying. It was quite an experience to see this kind of political aspect of our profession, and so it was an honor to be able to be there and to speak on behalf of the licensing board as a practitioner, as an educator, both clinically and in academia. It was just a fascinating process. So I was just grateful for the opportunity.
We very much appreciate you being there. And Navy, are there any other public comments on item number 5? Yes, Chuck.
So obviously I wasn't at the hearing, but I want to commend the board for all the work that was put into the volume, large volume of information known as the Sunset Report. And I'll say that other states will be looking to that report starting now and for several years to look at that process and all of the data that's collected and essentially showing here's what the board does, here's why it does it, here's questions from the legislature, here's how those responses are framed, and then also making the hearing available. So not all states have a sunset review process, several do, some not nearly as involved, but I think that the work that was done here can be showcased to other boards and other state associations to see what's involved and perhaps help them as they go through their own process. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? Okay. Seeing that there are none, if we could move on to agenda item number 6, discussion and possible action on NBC OT Navigator online continuing competency tools. Heather, do you want to give us a brief?
Yes, so this item is a follow-up from the December meeting when Sean Conway came and gave a presentation to the board on the NBCOT Navigator tool and the various components. The board had some follow-up questions, and so as a result, the documents included in the materials include the Navigator tool description and assessment objectives. And then also their 2012 certification renewal practice analysis study of the executive summary of that. There was also a question at the December meeting regarding what some of the other states are doing regarding the PD requirement relative to the Navigator tool. And so included in the materials, thankfully to AOTA, they have collected this information, and basically we took that document, someone reviewed it, and then here in the materials are the actual statutory or regulatory language for a variety of states. That was at the board's request. And so I believe Sean is here to answer any follow-up questions folks might have after reviewing the materials. Lastly, there is one additional item in here. OTAC had submitted some comment about the Navigator tool, and that's also contained in the materials, but we are fortunate that Sean was able to come out again to be available to answer your questions.
Sean, did you want to speak at all and cue us up with some of the, in terms of the continuation of the discussion where we left off and what you provided? Would you like to cue us up on anything you are specifically looking for from this board?
You bet. You bet. First of all, good morning, everyone. And thank you, as always, for allowing us the opportunity to be here and to have an opportunity to dialogue with you about these tools. We really do appreciate that. As Heather and Denise both mentioned, we did provide a presentation to the board in December of last year, and the focus of that presentation was around the NBCOT Navigator initiative. And one of the things that we did spend a fair amount of time on was the discussion point around the fact that a certification renewal practice analysis study had been conducted as part of this initiative. And for those of you that were at the meeting, you may recall that this was the first practice analysis that had ever been done with regard to certification renewal. So that is very significant. And there were over 2,500 individuals involved in that study, occupational therapists, occupational therapy assistants from around the country. And you also may recall that there was a very significant response rate in terms of participation in the study, which was about 77%. So I think for those folks who are involved in research, I think you can all appreciate that that is a very, very strong response and one that we were very pleased with. And there again, I think it's important to point out that those results really lend itself to the participation and to the validity of the evidence that came through with the result of that study. So what we've been doing is, as you know, having conversation with occupational therapy licensure boards around the country related to the Navigator. There are two purposes in these discussions. One, it is to help provide information, to help inform and educate about the Navigator tools, what they are, the fact that they are an optional type of tool available to currently certified occupational therapists and occupational therapy assistants. And it is available to a certificant 24 hours a day with the idea that they are very interactive. They are tools that are there to help meet individual needs based on what it is that the individual is looking to achieve. So if they're looking, for example, to transition to a new patient population, if they're looking to transition to a new setting, those are some examples. Those are some very practical scenarios in which these tools really do lend themselves to practitioners who are looking to identify what are their areas of strength and what are their areas in which perhaps they could pursue additional knowledge. And as we all know, through the presentation provided in December, the idea is that through participation in each of these tools, in which an individual has to meet a minimum threshold in order to successfully complete it, provided that he or she does meet that threshold, they are provided with current evidence-based literature sources that you may recall are pulled automatically out of the ProQuest and RefWorks databases. So it doesn't just stop there. That process doesn't stop there. It continues, knowing that individuals have that information available to them. The question that we have asked of each of the boards is whether or not, if a licensee successfully completes one or more of these tools, is that competency development initiative an activity that the board would potentially accept for continuing education or continuing competency purposes? That's really the question in a nutshell. If Susie Jones writes to you, or she calls the board and says, you know, I've completed 3 of these activities. I've been awarded units for successfully completing these activities. And can I now apply these as one of my activities? Again, it's optional, not required. But can I include them in an effort to help meet the continuing education or competency requirement in which the state has established? So that's where we left off in December. Fast forward to just in the last week, I had called Heather to make sure that we were providing and bringing forward information that would fulfill the board's request for this particular meeting. And in that discussion, Heather mentioned to me that the state is already accepting units for audit purposes, meaning units as a result of successfully completing the NBCOT Navigator tools. So when I heard her say that, I paused, and she well remembers it was just last week, and I said, let me make sure I'm correctly understanding. Are you already accepting these for audit purposes? And she confirmed that yes, the state is already accepting that. So then I said, you know, that really is the crux of our question. That really was sort of the heart of what it was that we were asking each of the boards to consider. So I share that with everyone here so that we're all on the same page, because this just came forward, you know, for my knowledge and understanding last week. And so I wanted to make sure that collectively we all have a common understanding of what the board is currently doing. And I don't know, Heather, if there's anything else that you would like to add, but that was certainly very enlightening information for me, I would say, because I was not aware of that. So I don't know if there's anything else that you want to share or not.
No, I think the most clarifying thing was that I had shared with Sean that I wasn't real clear on what NBCOT's inquiry to the board was, because of the fact that the board currently accepts these activities. And so I think we both kind of had an aha moment that we were talking about the same thing at the same time and didn't really have a full understanding.
So I have a question. I wonder, in our packet in item 6, the section on the state affairs group, is that something, Chuck Wilmark, that is put together by AOTA, what each state requires?
Sure. Periodically, we gather statutes and regulations, we post it on our website. We update it as much as we can. I'm not sure what iteration this was, but yes, we do compile that information.
So then I noticed California's not in our packet, so I would have to bring it up. But do you know, does California say the course is recognized by the national board? Does it say in our?
It does not.
It does not. So is that what you're asking us to
So there are two, I think there are two separate questions there. So your question, Denise, I think is whether or not the board would want to consider recognizing NVCOT as a professional development provider. I think that's, if I'm understanding correctly, I think that's kind of what you were getting at. That initially was not NVCOT's question. Our question was very specifically about the Navigator tools as a type of competency development activity, and whether or not, when someone comes to your board with that type of activity, in the whole menu of all the other types of activities that the board already recognizes, would it be another one that potentially could be recognized or accepted by the board? So I think there were two questions. That was our question. That's the question that we've been having dialogue with state regulatory boards about.
Do you
Fair enough?
know, as a follow-up, if I may, do you know how many state regulatory boards or approve your courses?
We do. There are 33 states as of today, in addition to the District of Columbia. And bear in mind, as we talked about in December, the Navigator Tool Initiative was launched in June of 2015. And so it has been since June of 2015 to current date that 33 state regulatory boards, in addition to the District of Columbia, have indicated that they would accept these as an optional type of activity. These are optional for licensing renewal purposes if a state were to accept them. And I think it's also important to make sure that everybody knows and understands, and I know we discussed this in December, but for individuals who elect to use these tools to renew their NVCOT certification, these tools are optional. They are not required. And that is a very, very important point. They're optional across the board. If someone elects to use them, that is their choice.
I had a follow-up question to that. So you say there's 33 states in BC who currently accept this.
Yes.
Do you mean that you've had a conversation and they've agreed, or that they've actually amended their regulations to that? I guess I'm kind of curious.
Yes, absolutely, you bet. So I would say, Heather, that there's been a combination.
Okay.
So we have had conversations with all of those. In some cases, some of the states were able to go ahead and confirm, yes, based on the way our regulations are currently written, we can accept these and we will accept these. They didn't have to make any revisions to the regulations. And Denise, to your question, in some cases, some of the states have sections in their regs that, in addition to AOTA, state associations, they have already gone on and identified NVCOT as a recognized provider. Not in all regulations, but in some. So it has varied. And then there are some states that have made revisions to want to move in the direction of acknowledging or recognizing these tools as one of the many tools in that whole menu of options. So it's sort of a combination.
Well, I think what I'm trying to gather here, I know we talked about it last time, I think what I'm gathering from the conversation here is that our position is about the curriculum and the accessibility of access, not particularly picking a particular vendor. And I know that maybe was the genesis of one of the letters of opposition, is that we don't want to limit the ability into one particular vendor, but as long as the tools that the vendor provides meets our minimum curriculum, what is that? Is that kind of where we are? We've said if it provides this kind of education, it qualifies, and we don't necessarily look at who's providing it.
Correct.
Right. So that's why we don't need additional approvals.
If I could read the continuing competency rule, I pulled it up. Do you want me to read that? Would that be helpful? It's section 4161 B. It says that professional development activity is acceptable to the board this is under continuing competency. Professional development activities acceptable to the board include, but are not limited to, programs or activities sponsored by AOTA or OTAC, post-professional coursework completed through any approved or accredited educational institution that is not part of a course of study leading to an academic degree, or otherwise meets all of the following criteria. So the three criteria are the program activity contributes directly to professional knowledge, skill, and ability. Two, the program or activity relates directly to the practice of occupational therapy. And three, the program or activity must be objectively measurable in terms of the hours involved. And that's in our regulations. And I was struck by that language and how it contrasts with some of the regs that are up here in the document supplied by OTA, where they specifically talk about a course, courses that are approved by NBCOT, which we're not limited by the language that says, is it a course, is it not a course? We have a definition that seems that makes it clear to me why we were able to accept this as a professional development activity.
I have a comment. Sorry.
Yes.
So, Richard, thank you for reading that language. Sarah, I think part of the discussion in December was that very understanding as far as this regulation allow this group of courses or education to be accepted, and if not, would the board consider either adopting specific language and so on. So, first of all, I thank you for the amount of information you provided. I think it was extremely important. And thank you for your letter as well. I think the concerns from the output of the letter we received was, to your point, Richard, that we are not talking about it specifically. We're talking about the inclusion of an existing vehicle of courses that are acceptable, not acceptable, and yes, can be acceptable. Two, I don't know if this now generates a question of should we be specific in our language as to how many courses need to be personal contact versus non-contact, and would that have any influence going forward? I think that might be a bigger concern, which of course is open to the audit as the course goes through the audit. So I think we're in a position with all this information that it's correct conclusion, or is it good for a professional discussion? Yeah, so I'm saying, have we concluded with our?
Well, the other question I was going to have before we read the thing was, I know that you said you're approved in 33 states plus the District of Columbia, but are there any parts of your Navigator that these other states are not accepting? Because there's many modules within your Navigator, and I think we had some conversations in one of ours about ethics and things that might not have necessarily been considered. And now there's something on our agenda for that. Are there parts of your Navigator that have been clearly said that they may be good for the broader knowledge of the profession, but not necessarily adds value in the sense of continuing education? That it makes you a better person, but it doesn't make you a better OT, right? So, I mean, those would be the things that I think Heather and her staff would be looking at when somebody would submit portions of that, whether the portions within that module satisfy the hours required that would be coverable versus portions of that module that might be submitted that might not necessarily advance the person's work within the profession. And I think that's where I don't know if there's any in there that you can talk to that may be a place where you think we should be looking to maybe have further clarity.
You bet. Thank you all for these questions. I mean, really, they're good questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this exchange. So in response to your question, the answer is no. I am not aware of any state that has placed a limit on a type of tool within the Navigator toolkit. Now that said, and one of the things I know that we chatted about in December, but I just want to reemphasize it, is that how a board chooses to implement this is completely up to the board. So for example, if the board wants to say, okay, I think under the way in which our regulations are written, I think we could potentially accept or recognize this, but we'll only recognize it for up to X number of units. That's an example of a decision that's completely within the board's discretion, and we fully expect and anticipate that. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, no, that goes back to Teresa's question is on the percent of face-to-face versus
Absolutely.
How you lose some of that interaction if it's all on a monitor.
Yeah.
I do have a point of clarification that I just need to understand, and this is to our executive director. So the board has also been discussing board-approved courses providers,
Correct.
under a different topic. So if we were to, and you've already identified, NBCOT is an accepted provider already?
Yes, they're not listed in the regulations along with AOTA and OTAC as an approved provider. They're not listed there, but their activities are issued, whether it's somebody who's an NBCOT approved provider who then submits something, or somebody who submits a certificate for completing some of these activities.
So from the timing of this coming forward to us, is the timing make sense then? Again, that NBCOT is asking us to recognize this, and we are also at the same time updating all of our board-approved providers. So is this something we could take action on in that, or is this something we should do individually?
I kind of feel like it's two separate things because the proposed legislation was specific to the providers of the post-professional education courses, which are specific to advanced practice areas. Other than that, there's a myriad of providers out there that offer both in-person and online courses that the board accepts based on the description of the way the reg is written, rather than because they are mentioned in the reg as an accepted provider, meaning OTAC, AOTA, and post-professional education institutions.
So then just one last question on this topic. Is it a fair statement that just in terms of the visionary piece of the board, the future, if our discussion now for this board is on the board approved providers for advanced practice, that is it a fair statement for a future board within 4 to 5 years, 3 to 4 to 5 years would probably also then be having a discussion like this about these types of providers, about all our coursework?
The board could, from a policy perspective, it would require legislation, but if the board wanted to go that direction, they could.
And I appreciate that. Just so the rest of the board knows, that was those clarifying questions were to figure out what's before us today. So I appreciate you going the distance with me.
I have another question. So, Heather, so you're when the board accepts PDUs using this activity, it does. Are we accepting the evaluation in terms of hours that is listed here? And that's similar to what we do for other professional development activities. And there is no current. What is the current review process in general for that? The evaluation issue.
So typically it's determined through an audit, and that's when we actually see the certificates. We don't see them really any other time, and unless it's an applicant who has not practiced in the last 5 years, then they have to submit the actual 40 PDUs in order to re-enter practice. So that's a little bit different, but other than that, we only see the certificates at the time of audit, and there's no evaluation of either the provider or the course itself, or the amount of time that the provider has identified the activity or course to be worth. If it's something that it appears to staff, which are obviously not clinicians, that it doesn't appear to be related to occupational therapy, then we reach out to the person being audited and ask them to explain. And so then they say, this is how this relates. And then it's typically accepted in that direction. Does that help?
Yes, I was wondering if, in my mind I was thinking, do we need to evaluate these, double check the ratings of these, but we don't really double check the ratings of any of our courses. Right. So why would we treat these differently?
Right. Well, and I think just to one point, a lot of the other providers that are giving courses either in person or online, a lot of them aren't based on a practice analysis. And so I feel like that's kind of one piece that's being missed in terms of the concern that it's online. So many other courses are also online, and people get certificates, and you don't really know if it took them 20 minutes or 4 hours. But the provider says this is worth a number, be it 1, be it 2, what have you. So it's certainly something that the board could look at further, but I would, just strongly encourage it, that if the board wants to go that direction, that I mean, this would be a really big multi-year process.
Coloring this, oh, sorry.
The only thing I'd say is that we're talking about the associations for the profession. I would understand greater scrutiny of a private provider who's just coming in for profit, trying to offer something up that they may be trying to, maybe they were training welders last week, but now they want to go into occupational therapy, that they may create a curriculum that might not necessarily jive with what our PDUs really need, where you have a professional association. They're only going to damage the professional association if they try to cheat on the hours and things like that. So I would just hope that they build into their online testing the same kind of things that are built online for our testing, which a person can't rush forward and not actually participate. They actually have to sit there and do the time to actually get the courses, and because I think that the curriculum probably is just as good as any folks that are doing it in a classroom setting.
We do have, go ahead.
Well, coloring this, I just wanted to bring up something that happened in the hearing on Monday before the Senate Business and Professions Committee, which was when the nursing board was being, their testimony. Senator Hill brought out sheets of courses that that are accepted nursing courses, and he brought up these very, I would say, he didn't characterize them, he just read the descriptions of them. And they...
Healing Arts, Acqueen.
Yeah.
He was questioning
how they're a little airy. Well, one of the nurse actually tried this airy-fairy courses that were approved courses by the nursing board, and he was clearly questioning the validity of these as continuing education courses that really develop skills that are practical in the workplace. And it was a fascinating exchange that made me sensitive to what we're accepting as courses. The nurse testified, in fact, the board member, the public member, responded that you also have physician credits given for Deepak Chopra courses at an institute in San Diego, for example, that are also along the same lines of healing arts and releasing the healing person within you and things like this. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because we heard that, and that's a concern for the Business and Professions Committee and something we should be aware of.
We have a couple of public comments. Do we have a board member? We'll do the dialogue or we'll come back. Do you have comments?
No, I think it was more just from this discussion, this point, I want to make sure that we just reiterate and clarify that the existing legislation allows for acceptance of this for our existing process, and from that point, any new discussion will be a new item.
We have public comment.
Thank you. So I guess I'm a little confused about where we are, because when we were talking in December, it wasn't clear that this was already being accepted. So if these points are already being accepted, then what are we having a conversation about? Secondly, as I recall the conversation in December, there was a question by this board about how the different activities offered by the Navigator were valued. What's a CAU versus a PDU? In the Navigator, there are multiple activities. For example, there's a multiple choice mini practice quiz, and 0.5 units are awarded for completion of that activity. And I believe the question at the time was, where's the data to support that? When you have your regulations that say the program or activity must be objectively measurable in terms of the hours involved. And so I thought there was a conversation about, well, where did that number come from? And I thought I heard, well, we did some beta testing and we'll bring that data forward. And the information in this packet, as far as I can tell, doesn't address that. Overall, AOTA is not opposed to the Navigator, and we've said that multiple times. But we believe that it should be clear in regulations that this type of activity, competency assessment, knowledge and skills assessment, that should be called out. I mean, in your existing regulations, you have structured mentoring, supervision of field work, you have courses, all those things. If competency assessment, knowledge and skills testing is an acceptable activity, it should be mentioned. If there's a limitation on the number of CAUs or PDUs that are awarded in that category, that should be clear too. We need to make sure that if this new professional development activity is allowed, that other providers, such as AOTA, the State Occupational Therapy Association, and others, they have to be clear that this is something that they can do. I guess I don't have, AOTA doesn't have a problem that the Navigator is being recognized, but there should be some parameters in regulations to make it clear about what is involved. That's my suggestion.
For everybody. For everyone,
Sure.
right? Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Any other comments?
I just had 2 comments about the content and about the time amount to take it, as Chuck was bringing up. The content is based on practice analysis, and that practice analysis, you have a copy of it here, is a parallel process to the practice analysis that was done to determine the blueprint of the NBCOT exam, and that's a process that NBCOT has done for many years to establish entry-level practice for our folks that are sitting for the exam to enter the profession. This is a parallel exam. It's not entry-level. It was designed to look at post-entry-level practice. So it uses a very rigorous process to determine the domains of practice that OTs engage in, and it also looks at criticality and frequency. So to the questions about content of the material in these tools, those are based on practice, so linked directly back to practice. So that's just my comment on that. And then again, in terms of the time frame, we did collect data on the time taken, and we're very conservative in our estimates of, allowing time for those. And, perhaps that's data that can come forward, but that was done very carefully to be realistic in terms of the expectation of time that people would be taking on any one of these tools.
Yes.
And, I would want to add to Chuck's point as well, and I know that we talked about this in December, but I just want to reemphasize the fact that from NBCOT's perspective, since we launched this initiative, there has never, ever been any intent in any way, shape, or form to bring the Navigator forward in exclusivity. And that's really, really an important point of clarification. In fact, we have always thought about this completely the opposite. That as organizations, as professional development providers, over time, develop additional tools, integrating technology, etc., that of course those would be recognized by regulatory boards. I mean, honestly, I think the question is, why wouldn't they? If the rigor is there, as Pam is talking about. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that that is not a part of this request whatsoever. And it was never a part of this request. It's never been included in any verbal comment. It's never been included in any presentation, any PowerPoint, anything like that. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that in fact it was completely the opposite expectation. That any entity that brings a tool forward that has this kind of foundation based on evidence, I mean, what Pam was talking about is really significant. How many other providers can you point to that have done practice analysis to support the professional development that are being provided? I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm just saying it's rare. And a practice analysis is incredibly comprehensive. It involved individuals from all over the country. A tremendous amount of psychometric analysis was done, and review of metrics, and beta testing was done before this initiative was ever released, involving thousands of practitioners around the country. And remember from our discussion in December that the average number of years of practice, let me correct myself, the average number of years of people being certified, so from the date of initial certification to the date in which the individual participated in the practice analysis survey, that average for OTRs and COTAs was 12 years. 12 years certified. So clearly, in contrast to what Pam was mentioning with the entry-level practice analysis, looking at a different cohort, looking at a different phase of their practice. And, I just want to emphasize the importance, the value of the practice analysis that was done to support this.
May I just ask if anyone in the room here would feel that, allowing this activity as a professional development activity, as opposed to some other professional development activity of a similar rating, harms the consumer?
I also think, just to sort of put some thoughts as we conclude around this, very great discussion, by the way. Do we have any further public comments? Did you want
Well,
to?
yeah, I did want to say on behalf of OTAC that we're largely in agreement with the discussion presented by Chuck representing the AOTA. It was, I thank the board for bringing up at least two of the points. There were about 4 in the letter from OTAC. I know that you've acknowledged the market competition issue. I thank you for discussing that briefly, as well as what was brought up about the issue of how many of the 24 biannual units would it be, and just the issue of balance, which, by the way, I think this board always has a commendable history of discussion on, such as previous discussions with how many fieldwork units, it can't be more than 12, etc. I always appreciate this board is very cautious and evaluative of how many of the 24 units can be any one thing, so thank you for that always. But I do want to just point out for the record, I suppose, that the letter included some of the points Chuck brought up about what CAUs are and how they translate and some of the data that was asked for. I also wanted to speak to Mr. Farrow's comment. I agree with him that we aren't talking about a group that previously served plumbers, as was his metaphor, We are talking about a group that comes from born of the profession itself. However, I believe the term used was an association, and it is actually important to know that the NBCOT is not an association in the same sense that the AOTA and OTAC are. And quite respectfully, I offer that the profession is served best by a diversity of groups. That is why we need licensing boards. That is why we need associations. And that is why we need other entities to oversee, of course, our entry exam, etc. But it's also important to remember how we're different, because we are all driven largely by typically a primary agenda that's different, such as the board protects the consumer and the association's looking out for the profession in total. And my point in that is that for me as an individual practitioner, aside from my role in OTAC, it's always very important to me to know that I actually stand a chance of having a seat on this board should I choose to pursue such a thing. In the democratic process of the state of California, I actually could sit on this board. Do I have the equal chance of being a member of the NBCOT board? Not as much. It's a different process. It's a different type of entity. So I just wish to be clear that the NBCOT serves many important roles. And I said before, I still high-five R proudly. But they're not an association. They are coming from a different angle with a different kind of budget and purpose and vision. And I think that that's significant for any provider of educational units for renewal, for the board to understand where all of the agenda, perhaps, behind the offering. So just to be clear on that difference.
Sure. Thank you for those comments. Thank you for all of the comments. I think to reiterate the point that was brought up by Board Member Davies, and to also go back to what was read by Vice President Bookwalter, we know that within our definitions, specifically A and C, under continuing competency, as well as C, professional development activity, and for the purposes of you having been here, I won't read them again, but we have already in our discussion identified that we do recognize NBCOT as falling within one of those categories, or at least our board staff, our executive director who oversees the entire board staff approving that has recognized that we already do that. So seeing that that's the case, we don't at all, to further reiterate the history, we haven't as yet as a board specifically, other than advanced practice guidelines, said we accept this, but we don't accept that. So that being said, it's already happening. if there's further action that you are requesting, either from an association standpoint or an NBCOT standpoint of this board at this time, I would ask that you state it so that we could put it on a future agenda item.
I will say that, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this discussion. This has been very useful. And from our perspective, we have obtained the clarification from you that we were initially seeking. So thank you. And we don't have any additional requests of the board at this time.
The only request I'd have is that I'd like board staff to look at the very item that Ms. Davies raised, which is there and going back to Ms. Kitchen, is there an acceptable percent of those PDUs that should be in person versus accepted? And, I don't know that we need it by next board meeting, but I'd like them to start looking at that, look at what the trends around the country are, and then look at ourselves, what we think is the best practices for that.
So your
My
motion would be, in a minute, if we have, is to put it on a future agenda item. Do we do that now or when
To
we?
clarify, isn't section, we do have an item under 9 that would talk about just
Future items.
analysis in general. Like item 9 is, we're looking at something with practice analysis, occupational analysis overall. Would that not be a component of that discussion? Would it go in that direction?
It could be.
And I think
Very
that's
much
the
could be.
point that I wanted to make. And again, I think you brought information on all perspectives. I agree wholeheartedly that there needs to be an evaluation of existing providers and that percentage, but I don't think it's limited to just. And that's where I think I struggle with this conversation. And I'm sorry for maybe providing the evidence, but I don't believe this is the forum for you to defend your curriculum or not defend your curriculum. I think there's a process for that. And I think we need to evaluate it as a whole from all providers. So that's where I want to really just move the agenda forward. But I think item 9 may be a better area to discuss what we want to incorporate in our overall analysis and decisions moving forward rather than separate.
Yes, I would like that.
Oh, okay. So for agenda item 9, it's actually, it's a DCA evaluation. They're going to discuss what an examination evaluation would look like and an occupational analysis of the practice of OT. So it's slightly different. It's specific to license validation, or not license examination validation. So it's slightly different, but just I wanted to make sure that
It's probably better.
agenda item.
It's likely better. Thank you, Ileana.
You're welcome.
It's likely better suited for a future agenda item, for a future meeting. If I may, Sean Conway, because I don't know how many meetings you'll come, I just want to go back historically with one more question.
Sure.
And a point of clarification, because I think this is what may have added to some of the confusion. You came to us originally under our question around license portability. Is there something specifically you are trying to tie in with this Navigator tool related to portability? Okay.
No, just to be perfectly clear, those are completely separate issues, and this
Right,
request
right.
was unique and specific to the Navigator tools.
Very pleased we have clarification. So, thank you for that. So if we could, do we have a motion? Is there a motion that's so moved by any board member to put the discussion specifically regarding acceptable PDUs for this navigation tool on a future agenda item?
I'd like to modify it, not this particular the navigation tool. I think it's the difference between, in-person PDUs versus online PDUs is what I think it is, or some other, technological mode as they evolve over the years. I think it's really understood.
Can we roll it? I'm sorry. Can we roll it into the evaluation of renewal of course? Well, no, that's a different kind of course. Right. So no, sorry. I'm talking about two different types of courses.
So thank you. So you were actually making a motion.
My motion would be that we task board staff to do a deep look at what other states are doing and to provide a recommendation on if we should have a differentiation between in-person PDU collections or online or some other technological form of being able to get your PDU required.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, do we have any public comments?
I have a different topic.
Can we finish our vote, our roll call, or
Oh, yeah,
do you
okay,
want to
sure.
be so moved? Okay. Okay, if we could take roll, please.
Teresa?
Yes.
Bianca? Laura?
Yes.
Richard?
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Sharon? Yes.
Okay, good discussion. You had a comment.
Right, so the real earlier request to the public was, is there something that the public would like to bring forward for a future agenda item? And I support what we just voted on. But what I would say, my recommendation is to look at the regulations and consider the development of a new category related to competency assessment, knowledge and skills assessment, to specify the parameters around that type of professional development activity. I mean, we're not arguing that NBCOT is a recognized provider and all that. It's, again, to bring forward in the regulations so it's clear to everyone that this is an acceptable type of activity and here are the parameters around it. So it's a broader discussion that I'm recommending for a future discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, and just to Chuck's point, because I know that this came up in December, so I just want to make sure again that everyone knows that Chuck's suggestion for proposing a new section be added to the regulations around continuing competency initiatives to give the parameters that he's referring to, that is something that NBCOT would support. I mean, that goes to my earlier comment. If there are other providers out there that are moving in this direction, that are integrating technologies, et cetera, then absolutely.
Ileana, did we take those questions now and do something on it, or Heather, even you would answer this as well? Or do we wait for the agenda item tomorrow under future agenda items? Do we circle it back then?
You can talk about it now if you want to, as a future agenda item. Do you want to include it? Or you can just come back to it tomorrow, whatever works better for you.
So for the ease in it being clear in our mind today, do we want to just agree that we want to have a future discussion? If I could just either see a yes or no, it's a little hard on this setup. Yes. Okay, so we will do so. Thank you for those public comments. And we have a vote. So seeing that there are no further items under section number 6, we will move to item number 7, discussion and possible action regarding availability of fieldwork sites, potential workforce shortage, and impact to applicants and consumers. So you, Heather, would be so moved just to give us a background on it.
So the item that first brought this to the board in December was the letter that is contained in the meeting materials regarding one of the large rehab companies charging the universities for placement of students for field work, which of course is required. I do not have a report back from either of the PT and speech works. What I can say though is that following the letter, this was sort of a two-part process, and it also had to do with the fact that a couple of out-of-state universities have programs accredited by ACODE, and they are offering them not only to California students, but also they are completing their field work in this state. And at the time, the conversation was around the fact that neither the board nor or the Bureau for Post-Professional Education had any regulatory oversight of these programs. And so the next piece in the materials is that the laws and I believe regs specific, so it looks like it's just laws, related to out-of-state institutes now having to be registered, which means that for the programs that are accredited and offering programs at a brick and mortar university out of state, If they are going to be offering that in California, then you can see they're going to have to start being registered, which while it does not necessarily, it doesn't bring them under the board's purview, at least there is another California state agency that is looking at them. And that's really all I have to report. It does not, this item is worded the same as it was before, which again, I think the board is kind of talking about the potential workforce shortage due to difficulties and challenges in getting the fieldwork placement for the students, which is required. And so there are several educators in the room who might want to add more to their concerns.
Okay, do we have any comments from the board?
Has there been any conversation with Genesis directly since we had this letter in our last meeting?
No, but it's my understanding that may happen soon.
I have received a call from the Genesis, one of the executives at Genesis. They were potentially coming to this meeting, but I did advise them that I did not speak for the board and I could not speak for the board, although I could listen to some of their concerns, that they were better suited to have that conversation with our executive director, who can have a discussion that's outside of board discussion. So what did come out of our conversation is that we will be at the American Occupational Therapy Association conference in Philadelphia at the end of the month, and we are likely to have a discussion and dialogue there. Any public comment on this matter? Yes.
Ada Boone-Hurl, Sacramento City College Program Director. In reviewing the out-of-state institution registration regarding the St. Catherine's Distance Education Program, accredited in Minnesota, when I look at this definition, it says all post-secondary educational institutions with a physical presence in the state, and that's in the opening paragraph. Then going down under the California Ed Code, the second to the last paragraph on the item that were provided, once again it repeats that without a physical presence in the state that offers distance education, the didactic component of this program is distance education. Their lab classes are in people on the ground, in facilities, touching each other. It is not a distance education platform. That is where I have a problem with this, their exclusion to our ability to have some kind of awareness, influence, regulation, whatever the correct term is, oversight of what is happening on the ground in California. If it was a purely 100% distance education model, a history degree, where you never saw people and you never touched people, then I would support what this is saying. I don't see that when they're going to monthly labs in Genesis facilities. Again, Genesis isn't the target, it's just that that's the factual statement of where those labs occur. That is not distance education. And that as an educator and as a program director, I have issue with that and concern for our inability to ask questions and oversee what's happening.
May I? Okay. So I would need to double check, but there may be an actual definition in the education code regarding what distance education is. So I would need to check and see if that might alter your analysis. And there's definitely some need for me to look into this a little bit more for you guys. I just wasn't sure how far this conversation would go today. So are you concerned with the fact that if there's out-of-state providers providing labs potentially in the state for students, would that not qualify as distance education? Is that your concern?
As an educator, I don't perceive that face-to-face, on the ground, touching each other labs is a form of distance education.
Okay.
So that's a laboratory experience. So even though there may not be a brick and mortar office from an administrative presence, there is an educational interaction that's occurring on a face-to-face basis that because it's accredited in another state and entering through this component of the education code, the state of California has no influence over what they're doing, their practices, etc. That's my concern.
And I think that's what this may have been designed to do, but I don't know how well it's doing it, so I'll look into it a little bit more. But right now, the only way to get OT to have more control or more say into what these schools are doing would be to add it to the OT Practice Act, say, because there are some boards, like Board of Registered Nursing, that actually does do approvals for their schools. So for schools providing registered nursing programs. So OT doesn't currently have that.
And I'm looking at a longer term. I see this as precedent.
Right.
For something that's going to be happening as we move into a combination of face-to-face and virtual education. And I would like us, as a profession and as a state, to be forward-thinking in that distant. I would hate to have to respond in hindsight rather than examine in foresight. Is where I really think my concern is. Because I don't see this going away and I see it expanding.
I do have a question for you, just in terms of clarification for the board, and specifically our board members who are not in practice in occupational therapy. Because you actually said a few things that piqued my interest that tie us back into workforce shortage. So we know the problem is a fieldwork site shortage, correct? And we know, therefore, because of this fieldwork site, that Genesis, that particular group and issue, knows that there's a productivity issue, which they, therefore, from a business model, decided to charge. Is it my understanding that this other institution, the University of St. Catherine, is paying that fee to Genesis? Is that why? Did you tie that in? I couldn't. Is your concern that they're going, this other institution, is it the concern of the code or is it the concern of practicality that they're going to pay for fieldwork sites in this state and you're in this state and can't get those same sites? Is that in there?
That's a separate venue in that that's a separate precedent that's happening, in my view. So one precedent that we have human beings interacting in an educational format in California, accredited in another state that we cannot control from a consumer safety perspective. That's one precedent that's being set. Another precedent that's being set is the charging of a stipend in order to take fieldwork students to recoup, my perception is to recoup business costs due to productivity. So I see those as two separate precedents that are occurring, both of which concern me. So this is one item, the taking of requiring of a stipend also greatly concerns me for the future of occupational therapy education. Because as you have clearly stated, the availability of fieldwork sites is already a challenge, which is a contributing factor to program expansion. We would expand at Sacramento City College if we could be assured of more clinical sites, which would then help to fill that workforce shortage. So I see those as two separate conversations from my view.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I think what's problematic for me, I'm trying to make sense of how is, when you are sharing your thoughts on, hands in hand in another state and offering certification and coming back to California, I think I'm having trouble understanding how is that different from an educator standpoint when our students come from all over different states. They go to, let's say, Tennessee for their fieldwork and they pass their AOT evaluation as an entry-level practitioner in Tennessee, because that's where we send them to fieldwork. They come back to California and take the boards. How is that different from what Genesis is doing? You know what I'm saying? If they're passing, I'm in my head, I'm saying, how is that different from, someone going out of state and passing their AOT evaluation in Tennessee at a hospital, then coming back to practice in California?
That student is sent to Tennessee in using that example under a memorandum of understanding of expected behaviors and expectations on the part of the educational institution and the providing fieldwork site. There's been extensive communication and ongoing communication and collaboration throughout that process. So I see that as a mutual arrangement that in which supervision is an embedded and ongoing process. Communication is embedded and ongoing. To have this Sunday, for example, in Stockton, a Genesis facility open for a lab, that none of us, there's no transparency, whereas in the fieldwork placement to an out-of-state facility, there's a transparency, there's a documentation, there's an access to the information, the communication, and the level of supervision that occurs in a situation like that. Unlike, we have no idea what's happening in that facility on that Sunday afternoon lab.
Are we privy to the level of licensing the St. Catherine's program has in the state of California with regard to other agencies?
I don't understand the question.
Well, there's been some discussion about these, the St. Cat's program maybe not following this, but we don't know that. I don't think we know that. Do we? Whether saying that St. Cat's is registered in another state but not registered in California is an assertion that's been made.
I do not know
we don't actually know
what their registration and fee payment status is.
And some of this stuff is effective July 1st of 2017, and it's not July 1st, 2017 first. But there may be some current thing, but we just don't know, right?
Right.
So they may be. There's a consumer protection issue if there's a program that's not properly licensed in the state, that might be working with occupational therapy clients. But if they are in compliance, is there a consumer protection issue for us?
So there's actually two programs that we know of. St. Catherine's is just one. Because the board does not approve schools, the board accepts those programs accredited by ACODE. The St. Catherine's program is accredited by ACODE in Minnesota, even though this program's primary student population is here in California.
The big issue is not whether they're in compliance with this ed code. I think for me what I'm trying to reiterate is that definition of distance education. Is there fidelity to the definition of distance education? And how can that be distance education when you're face-to-face in a brick-and-mortar building doing lab interactions together? That I think is my biggest concern. And that's where there was discussion of needing additional follow-up on that definition of distance education.
I do know that's coming up education-wise for online doctoral programs across the nation. That's been an issue. There is definitions that are coming out of what distance education is, because some states are now headed to kind of go with your conversations, charging. If you're not in a particular, I think it's called, you have to pay the state of, if you want your students to go and do online doctoral program, you have to be part of the states that your students are partaking in the education. You have to pay. So to be part of that, otherwise they can't be placed and do field work. I know that's happening. And that discussion is happening with online doctoral education. So it's going to be very interesting to see what our team finds out as far as how that's trickling down for distance education, master's level.
Well, just so we're all on the same page, this definition's in the education code, so it'll only be specific to California. So that's one comment, and then obviously that being the law, we don't know. There could be another section of the law that's not included here. It could be in regulation that they defined it. So Ileana can report back, but that even if the information that is presented, the board is in disagreement with, for lack of a better word. If it's a law, we would have to go talk to people and try to get them to amend their code. It's not like that would be this board's task to amend it. It would be to, ask another state agency and explain that position. Or even the same thing for amending the regs, because again, the board does not approve, and in the Board's Practice Act, it simply says an ACODE approved program. There's some qualifications to all of that, some constraints, I guess.
Certainly.
It is an OTA program again for people who are not as familiar with it. And they do have a program director, and I guess if there is some action that you're requesting the board, we could and he's in California, from what I understand. I don't know how often, but I know he comes here at regular intervals. We could potentially ask him to come before this board if there's questions for clarification. I don't. Do we have the authority to request that, or just a courtesy, or
To ask someone from another state to come and provide you with information in person.
Well, he's here anyhow. We
If
could
he's
give
here?
him our agenda.
Well, yeah, you can certainly ask him whether he wants to come is another story. You can't make him come, but, yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know whether that would be a discussion for you. I can give you his info. I went to the University of St. Catherine, by the way, for all. So did you, right? Yes.
Brick and mortar.
Yeah. At brick and mortar.
So if the board would like, I will await Ileana's information, and then maybe at that point we can see if it would be appropriate. Just because again, I mean, he obviously doesn't have to, but
Does our public have interest in that, by the way? Our educators, do you have interest in that? We're also going to AOTA. Maybe your questions will be answered by the Professional Association. It's unnecessary for us to.
In reply as a public educator in response to that question, I very much am looking forward to hearing your feedback from your visit to the AOTA conference and the follow-up discussion of the definition of distance education. Those are two very important things to me. What he says actually, because I don't think that he's a person that can really control this, I would like to see what the bigger picture is. That might be nice to have a visit, but those are the answers that I as the public am looking for. Thank you.
I would question our role in evaluating what distance education is or isn't, since that's not part of our mandate. That's an ACOT mandate. That's what ACOT does, and we simply accept what they do. And to have us get involved in where a school is located, and we've not done that before. We haven't gone to Western. When they opened their place in LA, we didn't have them come before us and justify what they were doing. We don't do that with any other education programs, and nor do we regulate education programs. So I would be uncomfortable overstepping our role by doing that. I mean, I'm sure, why didn't they open in Fresno instead of Sacramento? I mean, I'm with you on that. But if they did, and if they had, there wouldn't be this competition with your program right next door. On the other hand, is that this board's, and it does create issues for training, which we could certainly get into, but I don't know that it's appropriate for us to have someone come before us.
Well, it doesn't hurt to continue down the path of the regulatory language, which is in our purview, and maybe based on your thoughts, and again, this is really just discussion. There's no action being taken because we're really trying to figure out what our role is and how to navigate us particularly. Maybe the conclusion will come to after whatever the findings are from our legal team are to ask ACOT to come before us, or the profession might be the better place to ask ACOT to come before them. But at some point, there is going to be a regulatory issue potentially that could affect us, or a consumer safety issue that could affect us.
I just have one comment. So I'm in agreement with sort of Richard about just our position in this. I think an exploratory conversation regarding how ACOT, approves their courses, just in the context of reevaluating the Practice Act. I think we're going to move in the direction of approving schools or not. We might be in a better position because right now we don't approve schools, we accept schools. So in that evaluation, if that's a bigger discussion that needs to be considered, then I would ask them to know the details of how those courses are approved, how they're not approved, and so on. It's all as it relates to distance because it has impact on that decision. But I agree that I don't believe we should be looking for further information because back to your point, how is it different from the accreditation of other schools when you send your therapists out for accredited, for their field work in those schools that are already accredited? I'm having trouble seeing the difference as well.
Well, I think I see the connection though, for me though, as a fieldwork issue, a potential
Right.
consumer standpoint fieldwork issue, because we know we're having problems, now we have this huge company that's gonna start charging $1,000. So I think it is gonna trickle down to where it becomes a purview part of the board and something that we look at.
I'm going to go back to everything. Technology and our changing landscape is affecting everything we've done. Last year we spent a great deal of time talking about telehealth, which I'm not a big fan of because I'm not sure at the end of the day the consumer gets the best outcomes. I'm not saying that people can't be really good at giving advice over the phone, but I think at the end of the day, face-to-face meetings with your practitioners are probably the best way to be able to identify things that may not even be something the person identifies over the phone, right? That's a challenge. We talk about our challenges of field site workplaces, and we talk about this online curriculum that's provided to be able to give CEs, another challenge. And then we go back to this very point, is we have out-of-state universities that are doing like a quasi-in-state, out-state, where we may not have. I think they're a challenge. I think it's important for us to understand them. I think our best role on this is raised to those folks that deal with education and what is an approved education, that we as a board raise the type of questions you do to make sure that at the end of the day that they're at least meeting their minimum standards. I think the difference between using a West Coast university is that they are a brick and mortar that are operating within the state, and if we wanted to audit them and do all that, we could. This one has this like quasi in-state, out-of-state, and subcontracting, of which makes it a little harder for us to make sure that they're following all their standards. Am I right?
Just to be clear, this board does not have the authority to audit.
No, I'm just saying we could go to the
Okay.
board, the
Yeah, it
education
would be
group that
the-
does it. We should
Okay.
bring to their
Just
attention
wanna
and
make
let
sure
them
Yeah.
bring
Even though you
up.
understood maybe people under.
No, we don't
Right,
audit.
board can't
We
do that.
hear the comments.
Okay.
We share
Mhm.
what our consumers, both practitioner consumers and public consumers, are worried about, just like we would on anything else if there was a different board, and say, hey, this has come to us. We think it would be important that you take a look at this on your board that deals with these. Or maybe you already have and you can provide it to us so we can then share it at a meeting.
Right.
Yes.
Winifred Schultz-Crone, Chair of the Occupational Affairs Department at San Jose State University. So I have a request of the board, if you can make an inquiry to the board, the California Board of Education, regarding if this is regionally, if the St. Kitts program is regionally accredited. Having this, if you want to call it hybrid, of both distance and in-person, physical, clinical application, where it's not the clinical application where we are post didactic portion going on. But if I understand correctly, the St. Kitts program is doing this as part of their didactic preparation. So is this regionally accredited within this region? And so that would be not something that the board, this board would handle, but could make a referral or a request to the California Education Board to look at that. The second thing, now talking about the charging, as I mentioned in the testimony in December, I did indicate that right now, when we have to submit reports, annual reports to ACO, we are asked to collect data regarding student debt. For many of these individuals, and for many of our students, even the fact of going an additional 6 for OTRs, to go that additional 6 months is an extreme economic hardship. In our institution, there would be no way that we could pass this or that we could do anything with this fee. That does two things. One, it prohibits us from using this agency because we cannot afford that as a public institution. And we do not have a vehicle to pass those fees along to our students, nor would we. But then that eliminates those affiliations. That can protract a student's ability to graduate. So when you look at the net workforce and you look at supplying the consumers and providing consumers with the appropriate services that are necessary, we already know there is a workforce shortage within the state of California. Applying this additional fee restricts the access to fieldwork sites. Now, they can just flat out say no, but there is a differential here that it would preferentially have individuals that might be more economically advantaged, which many of our students are not. So they could pay to play. and that should not be how individuals are acquiring an education. And so I would ask for those issues to be presented to Genesis.
Can I say something?
Who are you asking to do that with? Yes, that I understand.
That-
Are you asking our professional associations? Are you asking
the board's asked what is happening with Genesis. We still don't have a statement from Genesis on if they're going to institute this completely. And I know that it's implied that it will start as of September 1st, 2017. And if that's the situation, that will eliminate those fieldwork sets from our bank. Because we cannot pass along those students. And we cannot do it.
question you wanted to ask? Was it Laura or Sharon? I can't see.
I think it's really important that the board stays aware of the state of our profession as far as the companies that are out there that are downsizing and doing whatever they can to make up for the fact that they've lost revenue. And so they're going to do things like what Genesis is doing. So if Genesis, you and I talked about this last time. If Genesis is a huge company and if they're doing it and they are successful, then you watch. It's going to be dominoes, and it's because of the state of the state. Companies are downsizing. Kindred is getting rid of their whole SNF business. Aegis Therapies, who I work for, is getting rid of, has gotten rid of all of their SNFs and becoming just a rehab agency, a rehab company, standalone. And so things are changing, and they're going to try to figure out a way to survive. That way to put it. Everybody's just trying to survive and stay ethical at the same time. And so it's the state of the state is what I'm trying to say. And if Genesis is doing it, and it looks like they're going to, then other people will kind of keep a real close eye on that and see if it helps.
And thank you for the comments. In response, the reason I'm bringing it to this board is from a consumer protection perspective and a workforce perspective. So it can have deleterious effects on the number of therapists who are available within this arena.
But it's not something we can control. But being aware of it and knowing what's happening in the real world out there helps us to be mindful of just that, I think.
Yes.
I think I mentioned this when we first brought this up, and I don't know if this is, again, a thought people would entertain or whether we had any legislators with the stomach to introduce such a bill, but I know that there has been efforts within the state for employers who are overly aggressive in taking advantage of the state to bill back to these employers who are trying to profit off the backs of California citizens. Though they can't charge them directly for doing that, they can charge them a tax that's equal to the amount that they anticipate getting from charging these fees, which makes it, not an incentive for an employer to actually go through with what they want to do. And that might be something, if we have a legislator that sees this as, threatening this profession by eliminating access to people to have this fieldworks opportunity and shifts, then maybe to be able to be a fieldworks provider or a supplier to fieldworks, you find a way that they get taxed an amount equal to the amount that it would cost the students to participate. I don't know. It may not be able to be one for one, but there's got to be a way that we can disincentivize through our legislature this threat to the industry, I think.
But the same threat, here's the thing, if we come out with a statement or have a measure that says you can't charge for it, and then they withdraw all those slots,
Right.
then that's counterproductive as well. So that's the problem. If this board takes a position, no charging can happen because then our students won't have access. And then they say, fine, there are no slots. We're not going to take students, which is what's happening now. And
I think our discussion the last time was that we make it a requirement for these operators to take a certain number of people to be
that would
trained,
have to be a part of
for
it.
them to be able to be licensed to be a provider, right? So, it's I think I used it in the analogy of apprenticeship. In the apprenticeship standards, you often have to have a 1-to-1 ratio of you have to have an apprentice to be able to be on this job for every journeyman person that you have working. So that way you continually provide a pool of qualified people that are important. And obviously, Governor Brown has seen the apprenticeship as a very valid education tool that saves costs and provides skills, and then goes to the very point that
Well, do we have an apprenticeship foundation developed, or does CFOT expand its role to include, helping subsidies for internships or some? I mean, there are other mechanisms for funding.
right, because what ends up then happening is that you can do an LEA back with the San Diego State University to be the provider of the apprenticeship program. They would get resources combined from participants, consumers, which would be the hospitals that would want to pull these people, and the state would have an interest, in the broader interest of the state, to be able to make sure. And some of that money could potentially come from the federal government, from new and innovative apprenticeships, if there's not a current one for the state. It could be, they call it, what do they call it, a generator, where if you have one but you're not getting the number of participants that you'd like to have, that you can then apply for these funds. I think it's something that we should look at going forward, maybe.
And I do think we need to be proactive, just because fieldwork, that this conversation has been ongoing for several years as far as fieldwork education, and it will directly, if our consumers are the institutions, our students, people that are practicing, it will very soon have, it may have a direct correlation to the board if we can't get licensure because we're not fulfilling fieldwork hours. And if facilities are starting to drop, this is going to be, the ramifications, like Dr. Schultz just shared, are huge in terms of who this could be affecting. And so I think the discussion for many years has been we need to be proactive on how we look at fieldwork, and maybe that model's changing.
And Sharon, that is what you've just stated there is the primary reason why this is on the agenda for this board. That's what it is only. Because we have professional associations here, which we will hear from, that there are other things that are under their purview to help address fieldwork sites and workforce reductions. But I know we have a comment from Board Member Davies.
Very quickly, I agree with Richard's statement, just as far as we may have unintended consequences. We're to suppress some of these fees that are now being incurred and charged. We may have unintended consequences, suppressing the availability of the work positions that are out there. I don't believe it is in this board's best interest to move in that direction of not allowing free market. I think in the consumer's best interest, when fees do increase and rise, it actually allows for competition to come in and provide additional resources for those consumers for those practitioners to have other avenues of achieving those opportunities. So I just want to make sure that while we're looking at more information and clarity from Genesis, I don't believe that we should be taking a position as to the direction they should be going. So I appreciate your statement as far as we need to have that discussion, but I don't believe it's asking Genesis to make a different decision or allowing them to forcing any kind of suppression on that.
And Board Member Davis, if we do have a meeting with Genesis leadership at the AOTA conference, our question specifically will be, similar to how we asked NBCOT, what specifically are you asking of the board that's under our purview? So we would be able to, Heather Martin, our executive director, will be able to, if this comes up on a future agenda item, which it'll likely stay, will be able to cue us up in that direction of what is specifically being asked of this board. Chuck Wilmore?
Yeah, just to the broader issues around fieldwork. I believe there's a statement earlier, Denise, that Denise participated in the Fieldwork Ad Hoc Committee at AOTA. I was a staff member of that. Some recommendations are coming forward to the program directors, academic fieldwork coordinators meeting at the AOTA conference, and then to the rest of the profession about the longer term and broader issues related to the experiential component of the practice, entering the practice. So, I mean, I can't say a whole lot more because right now the draft recommendations are being vetted, but more is to come, and I encourage the board to keep this issue on its agenda, and perhaps there'll be more to discuss in June. I would encourage the board to think about other professions and what do those experiential components look like. I mean, this isn't the only model. Our models like the PTs, there are other models out there. So certainly as the National Professional Association, we're acutely aware of our trajectory and our growth in this profession, which is tremendous, it's great, but the availability of fieldwork sites is really challenged. So this ad hoc committee looked at that, looked into the future, and has some recommendations.
Yes.
You know, just a thought of it sounds like the train's moving in that direction, at least for the discussion for fees. And so there's a lot of things to consider. But one of the things that comes to mind for me is that the transparency of where are those costs, you know, how really are those costs, what's within that $1,000 or whatever the fee may be. Is it to cover just the overall labor hit that you're taking, or is that $1,000 going towards the development of that supervisor, going towards covering the cost of the consultation time with the university? I don't know. And all these companies really behave in different ways. And some are very, very efficient, and some maybe are not so much. And so if this fee is just to offset some costs that may be attributed to inefficiency and an operation, that's, wow, who's going to take the hit for that? The university's going to take the hit, the students in some degree. I have concerns about that. I'm not necessarily off the board with some kind of arrangement to cover costs. I'm just concerned about, again, the transparency of that cost, because I work in a position where I'm in a lot of buildings. There are some that are very large, some that are not. Some companies that are very large, some that are small and regional. Some companies are very, very, they're constructed in a way so that their costs are massive. It's like United Airlines versus Southwest. Some are burdened by a lot of costs, and so they're looking to offset that cost. Some know how to operate, so they don't have that. So if the train's rolling in that direction of cost and adding stipends, I certainly want to know a little bit more about where that cost is actually going to go. How's that money being spent? Because if you look at just by numbers, well, we take on 300 students a year times $1,000 times 2 times a year. That's a lot of money that can go towards a spreadsheet that offsets costs, and that's nice, but maybe it didn't do anything towards covering the cost of the quality of that student. The supervisors are still under the same burdens of productivity and efficiency that they always have been. It's just covering some cost and lessening the hit. I have a problem with that. If the cost is going directly towards the competency of the student, thereby then the safety ultimately, okay, we can go in that direction, but I'd sure like to know a lot more information about where that fee is going and how it's being spent.
And I think you probably, first off, can you state your name?
Sorry, Ernest Escobedo, Accelerated Care Plus Regional Consultant.
Thank you. I think you will probably echo many of the students who once they begin to pay, or let's just say however this works out, even if whether that's coming out of their pocket or the university's paying, or however, the expectation of what they're receiving during that internship is likely to accelerate. But again, that's for groups other than this board to consider, but at least to know. Do we have further comments? Yes.
Just one very brief comment relative to distance education. I guess it
Can
was.
you state your name also?
Oh, Pamela Richardson, San Jose State University. I listening to the discussion, kind of a question arose in my mind: if people are teaching for a university outside of California, are they licensed to practice in the state of California? As educators in California, we're required to hold licenses, and I don't know if you have distance programs like that, if there's any monitoring of those folks that are teaching in this state. So that seems an immediate regulatory issue. limit that.
Did you there's a specific, is that just a comment or you have a request for the board? Yeah.
Well, maybe a request, because I think if you're gonna see more of this, that there would need to be a mechanism to ensure that those instructors are licensed to practice in the state.
That, from a legal perspective, the board doesn't really go that far in its jurisdiction. I can certainly look into what the options might be in terms of, you know, what appropriate avenue might be. But this board really, is their scope of authority is very limited in terms of just like, you know, licensing and, you know, making sure the public is protected. And although obviously all of this contributes to whether the public is protected in terms of, you know, provision of OT services, the board may not have authority to do what you're asking. But I can, like I said, I can look into it, and I'm happy to do that.
Well,
Board of licensing.
I'm a little unclear. Are we talking about an instructor at St. Kate's doing a course by telecom here, and then it's not that they're representing themselves as an occupational therapist? Would they have to be? Would they or would they not have to be licensed in California to do that?
Right, and I mean, the Practice Act for OT doesn't address. I mean, if they're teaching a course, because you're not actually providing any services. If you're teaching a course, do you have to be practiced? Do you have to be licensed? That's not covered in the OT's Practice Act. That actually straddles a little bit of the private post-secondary education in terms of the providers of educational courses. If the person was providing telehealth, that's a different conversation. So that's kind of why I'm saying that we're kind of straddling a very weird area, and it may not be something that the board can actually, you know, do anything, may not be able to act on. But like I said, if the board would like, I'm happy to look into it.
With all due respect, if I may add there is, with the regulation piece on that, or what's in the Practice Act, is a gray area. And I think in all fairness, we've had previous counts, because this issue has come before the board with university previous boards, and it was identified differently. So I just want to caution, so that we know it's not that one's right and one's wrong. We have excellent attorneys. It's that the law, the interpretation of the law on that is slightly different.
And like I said, I will look into it to make sure, because that's why I don't want to give you a yes or no answer today. I can't say, oh yes, you can do this, or no, you can't, because this requires more. I need to look into it on my part, and I need to give an answer that I don't know is 100% accurate. So if the board would like, I am happy to look into this and speak to the board's previous counsel and see where the circumstances may or may not be the same or different.
That would be actually really helpful if you were able to do that and provide us clarity on the next statement. Thank you, Eliana. All right, so there are more comments. Are there more comments?
I guess my closing, I would like to express that, I mean, we have this excellent conversation going on, which I think is representative of this nebulous future. And that's what I'm simply asking the board to continue to do this exploration. As an educator and an experienced educator, I would be very overwhelmed in running this type of program, the distance education component that I'm talking about, from another state and ensuring quality 1,000 miles away. Quality education is where I'm going at for consumer safety. I'm not worried about where they landed and that sort of thing. I'm worried about how do we make sure that that education is quality. When it comes to the charging of the fees, how do we ensure that there's equity of access to the diversity of practitioners that are available, or potential practitioners available in California, yet once again that goes to the quality of care available to consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. Have you submitted any comments like that to ACO?
No.
That might be a route specifically. I don't know if the profession wants to take a lead on that for the state of California with all program directors, but that might be a route for you to vet some of the, because I know specifically what you're asking this board, and I think we've all identified that we understand and we get it and we get what's
Right.
before us, but the other issues you brought up, and there are other people in our state that are in associations that can take a very good lead on that. Chuck, if you're so willing, I don't know if this question is I simply want to know, do you know what ACODE's statement is on anything related to Genesis? Is there a statement, or have they taken one, or will there be one? Or
I'm not aware that the ACODE has made such a statement. The issue related to Genesis was discussed by the board, and that brought up a broader discussion around the availability of field work, and that triggered the ad hoc committee. So, no, I'm not aware of the issue related to ACODE. I look forward to the recommendations from the ad hoc committee. And then just on your point about the ACODE, there is a call for comment on the new accreditation standards, and there's also an open hearing at the AOT meeting where you can stand in front of the mic and raise your issue. I encourage you to take advantage of both opportunities.
And Ada, if you're not going to be at a conference, but you want your comments so moved, I suggest you work through either your representative assembly or your who might else you suggest in the association that'll be there, Heather, that could bring yourself.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. So, okay, is there any more dialogue on this particular topic? Okay, the time is, just so the board is aware, we have been, it's 11:36 and we are going to take a short break. But we won't be breaking for lunch until after 1 o'clock. And the reason for that is that we do have students who on their lunch hour are joining us. And in the effort for them to see the dialogue that takes place at the board level, we're going to forego our nutritional needs. No, I'm kidding.
We're going on a diet until 1:30.
Right on. Going on a diet till 1:30. Well said. So with that being said, the time is now 11:37. If we could if we could take a short break, come back at noon, that would be good.